It's ANZAC Day, so on this anniversary of the landings at Gallipoli in 1915, I'm appropriately joined by New Zealand playwright and filmmaker and historian too, Arthur Meek. Arthur's been working on a project to bring to life some of the New Zealand voices of Gallipoli, a defining moment in their history more than a century ago. And those voices, I think, are especially important as the New Zealand veterans of the Great War, like all of them, have faded away but left us this important legacy. So welcome to the podcast, Arthur.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's great to be here.
So, I mean, I've had a look at your website associated with this, and I'm familiar with the book that you've based some of these guys taken their memoirs from. But tell us a little bit about you, how you came to this, and the kind of genesis of this project.
Yeah, so it's one of those situations. I am, as you said, a playwright. I generally work with historical fiction. I've worked with a lot of settler diaries. I've worked on stuff to do with Charles Darwin and the like. And usually that involves reading primary and secondary sources, but written things. I'd always had an interest in World War One, but I happened to be living with my brother who was working with Peter Jackson at the time he was making his wonderful film. And the house just happened to be full of books on the war. And it's one of those situations where I didn't so much find Voices of Gallipoli as it kind of found me. And I read these accounts, and they are oral histories, which, your readers will be familiar with. They had a special gut punch to these things. They all run at about 12 minutes to speak aloud. And what made these things really different was that the oral histories had been taken by one of New Zealand's premier novelists, a fellow called Maurice Shadbolt, and Christopher Pugsley, the New Zealand Gallipoli expert, military historian and expert. And the two of them talked to a number of veterans in the 1980s as background material for a documentary, which became the most expensive documentary made in New Zealand at the time, called Gallipoli, the New Zealand Story. And this documentary was meant to be based on the soldiers' testimonies. This was in the 1980s. All of the veterans involved were in their mid to late 80s, and effectively they started dying within months of the recordings. For a lot of them, it was their first and last chance to be asked. And we are lucky that they were asked by these two people, because many of you will be familiar with oral histories. I love them. Often they can focus on battles, troop numbers, tactics, that kind of thing. What you had was Maurice Shadbolt was asking them how they felt. Christopher Pugsley was there to make sure that ask them the correct military kind of questions, but these folks are telling you how they felt at the time. And what happened to the actual interviews was a bit of a tragedy, because these fellas were old, they sound like old men, there's lots of kind of ums and ahs. Basically, they weren't television ready, right? And their testimonies got cut. They were told that they were mumbling and so on. Shadbolt was aggrieved by this. He was so angry because they had won so much more than descriptions of Gallipoli. He had never seen or heard anything like what they'd been told. So what he did was he went through the transcripts, took out the ums and ahs, which of course you do, just knocked them into the right order, just shuffled the words around, and he didn't change a thing. But what he did was, just in the way that he presented it, was create these gut punch narratives from these fellows who were not, they were not officers. They were
ordinary
blokes who'd signed up. They were not keeping diaries. I love diaries, but these are not the kind of guys that would express themselves like that. This was their last chance to tell these stories, and they did. And there it was in a book, which you've read, and it's highly regarded. But to me, I read this and I was like, everybody needs to hear this. I am fascinated by the idea of memory and remembrance, and I'm excited by the challenge that we have in the UK. It might be around Remembrance Day. In New Zealand, we call it ANZAC Day, the 25th, Gallipoli Day, I suppose, over here. But it is a national holiday, and we made a promise: we will remember them. Now, we didn't say what we would remember them for, whether it was like, you are amazing heroes, we didn't say that. I think it's wonderful that on this day we go, hey, we're just going to hear what happened to you. And I wanted these voices to be part of those ceremonies part of that remembrance event. So I've been running this project since about 2023. My playwriting instinct was always to go, oh, this is a good story, but it's not quite right. I'll have to add this bit here or change this around. With these, it was a totally different calling. Like I had the calling, it was like, you just need to get these voices out there. So for the first 3 years, I made it very easy for museums, schools, and so on to take the testimonies and maybe present one or two. I made it a really important thing that no one had to pretend to be the veterans. So some of the most powerful stuff, there's a Palmerston North Girls High School does it every year, and you have these teenage girls standing there saying, I was a mechanic when the war broke out. It is so moving, and it's a beautiful act of remembrance. And then, so that has been all through New Zealand. I've presented one every year at the Gallipoli Association conference in London. It's even been down at Scott Base in Antarctica. Yeah, it's been, and everybody that sees it, everybody that experiences it, like, this is such an important addition to the way that we remember. And the exciting thing about this year is that what I've done is taken 3 voices from the Otago battalion, known as the Bad Luck Battalion. 1,200 men set foot on shore 25th, 26th of April in 1915. Within 2 weeks, they had 200 fit men. 200 men and 80 fit, and it only got worse from there. So the fact that you had 3 survivors of that was an absolute miracle. And what I've done is they were interviewed separately. They may have known each other, but I have interwoven their accounts, and you've got this polyphony, these 3 voices telling the story of signing up, training, landing on the beach, the war, and then really powerfully like coming home. So that's something in terms of memory. Henry Lewis, one of the things he said that just devastated me. I chased after quite a number of jobs, but no one would give me employment. I'd go for an interview and everything seemed satisfactory until they saw my discharge saying I was no longer fit for active service. They'd say, well, we'll let you know, and they didn't let me know. Men like me were rejected as junk by people in business. And the treatment that so what I've done is I did this script, and you can read it. It's really cool, but because I work in theatre, I've always been very interested by a specific form of theatre, which may be very familiar to your listeners, but it's called verbatim. And that is getting actors to speak the words, just speak the words out loud as they were. There's a number of kind of like approaches, but basically my approach is this is no dramatization, there's no acting. I got 3 people who I know are extremely competent. Well, one of them being me, I suppose. But yeah, 2 of my mates who happened to be over here, and we just got together in a recording studio and spoke these words, gave them voice. And what I think is important about that, because I do have access to the tapes of the actual veterans. It would take a hell of an edit job because Maurice Shadbolt did move things around in sequence and stuff. But these guys told their stories when they were in their 80s. But even the bit that I just said before, these are not the voices of old men. These are the voices of men who were as young as 16, in their early 20s. Like, those memories are seared in their imagination at that age. And I wanted that to be the energy that people got. This is not old men reminiscing. This is people in the prime of their lives experiencing something that no one had ever seen before. God hopes that no one will ever see again, though that's possibly not the case. And yeah, I wanted to let them say it in their words, not jump over the top, no context, just let the listener make up their own mind.
And I guess it kind of feels very contemporary by doing it that way, that this isn't something kind of just confined to the pages of history, that this story is still there, still relevant, still part of our collective knowledge and culture, really connected to the First World War.
It's so present in memory, but yeah, I'm a big believer in that idea that history isn't in the past, it's affecting us every day. in so many ways, and it's helpful for us to tune in every now and then because we can learn a lot. And for me, different things come up at different times, but what I think you have there in these voices, some of them were more or less gung-ho. Henry, again, he went to war because his father died when he was 8 and his mother died when he was 14. He was living with his stepmother and she didn't treat him so good. So he thought he'd go off to war. But this idea that one's life can just be completely upended and interrupted by something that happens and you kind of have to go with it. I think we've all experienced that over the last few years in lots of ways. And I think the suspension of judgment over that stuff is quite helpful for me when I'm thinking about what's going on now and what I have to do. And yeah, seeing that people have been wrestling with this forever is pretty helpful.
And going back to that moment when this was first done, I mean that was one of those, I guess, opportunities when the right people were all in the right place at the right time, with the veterans just being in those final years of their life, but still very kind of compos mentis and able to talk about their experiences. And then, like you said, the right kind of interviewers who could extract from them a greater meaning from their testimony than, as you say, just tactics or uniforms or weapons or whatever it is. Because for me, having interviewed hundreds of Great War veterans in the UK, the real kind of material that came out of that and the strength of it and the power of it was what I've read in the accounts that you've selected here, is that personal experience of the conflict, what it meant to them, what it was like, and how they live with it beyond the war.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the conditions, it was almost a miracle in the early 1980s that the conditions for these interviews were so sensitively put together. There was a lot of money spent. Shadbolt and Pugsley travelled to visit these fellows in their own homes. Often they had, wives, if they were alive, relatives in the room with them as kind of support as well. They were very concerned to make it a comfortable situation for them to talk, which, it may sound obvious now, but I'm sure that it wasn't, because what came across to me from these interviews as well is that these guys hadn't really had a chance to talk about it. As much as we're interested now, honest to goodness, people were not really interested in their stories because, it was just such a different experience that they had had. And especially when things didn't go so well, I guess it's great to come home the conquering this or that, but these guys had a pretty rough time. They were coming back into a society where many, many people had experience of terrible loss. And so these guys it was a bit of a slap in the face that they'd survived in a way as well. But I heard a very interesting, it's a hypothesis, but that First World War experience set back relations between men and women in New Zealand a generation or more, because you were coming out of, even the generation before, they were pioneers. You travelled over from England in a boat, you broke land together. It was hard work. It was terribly difficult, strenuous stuff, but you at least did it together. So you'd have some mutual context. And then these fellows are coming back. How do you describe something like Gallipoli to someone who just had not experienced it? And those people, the wives that they're coming back to, they'd had a heck of a war as well. A total lack of information, having to do a whole bunch of work to keep food on the table. They had been through a heck of a thing as well. And there was just a mutual incomprehension. So what you had, as far as I understand it, was where the RSA, the Return Service Association in New Zealand, I guess it's the BSL over here.
It's Royal British Legion in the UK.
British, RBL, Royal British Legion. They did talk to each other at those places, but they were very secluded. How would you say? They were little spheres where they would keep the memories kind of alive. The public were good about ANZAC. I think the first ANZAC Day was very hot on the heels of, it might have even been during the war. I'm sorry, folks, I don't have the exact things there, but there was that remembrance, but how much people mucked in with that is open to question. And I think now we've got much greater distance. There's a lot more kind of interest in people whose relatives were involved, and we're living in a really nice time. But I'm very aware of how hard it was for those people to talk about what they experienced and to talk about it in a way that other people could understand.
I mean, I've had British veterans describe it as a kind of terrible silence, that they returned from the war unable to verbalise what they'd seen and been through, particularly to close family relatives, not just their wives, but eventually their children. I mean, I had so many that said to me, you've got my dad to say things that I've never, ever heard him say. So, and I felt at the time that these guys just didn't, not that they didn't have the language, but they were perhaps initially too close to it. And as time went on, I mean, some of them sadly just faded away before their testimony was ever heard beyond their immediate family or the blokes that they drank with in their local veterans organisation, which I think is why this kind of thing that was done in the 80s is just so important. And the power of the material that you've put into this is just incredible.
Thank you. When were you doing were you interviewing in the 80s as well then?
Yeah, so I started in about 83, 84. And then when I went off to uni, I was down on the south coast of Britain, which is a big retirement area, and there were loads of places where veterans had gone to retire to, or there were care homes with them in. And I used to ring up these places, and I'd say, have you got any First World War veterans? And they'd say, how many do you want? That kind of thing. And I mean, my dad was a veteran of the Second World War, so I had a very much an older father. And I realised now that I understood how veterans thought and how they tried to talk about their experiences, which I was then able to use to pull out of these guys stuff that they'd never really said to anyone else. So, and I get I know Shadbolt's book. It's a fantastic book. Voices of Gallipoli is one of those kind of classic books, and Chris Pugsley is a fantastic guy. I mean, I took that book of his about the New Zealanders at Gallipoli with me the first time I went to Gallipoli, and we stayed at ANZAC, and I walked up to the New Zealand outpost cemeteries and all that kind of stuff, all the time. It's just, I mean, they were spot on, exactly the kind of guys, I think, to have done this project. But it wasn't an easy task to get men to say things that they'd not been able to confront in some cases themselves.
What did you find was what was it easy for them to talk about that you got them started to talk about first?
Their life before the war, actually. I used to kind of start them. They thought I would go straight into the first day of the Somme or Passchendaele or kind of whatever it was. And I would take them back to their childhood and get them to talk about where they grew up. What did your parents do? Where did you go to school? When did you leave school? I mean, most of them had left school at 12, which was the school leaving age then, and gone off to work in the fields or factories or coal mines or, kind of whatever it was. And I found that got them back into that mindset of that period, and a kind of a timeline approach almost to it. And then you got to the war. And by the time you got to the war, they were kind of pulling stuff out of their past in a better kind of way than if I'd have just launched straight into, one of the great battles, or what was it like to live in a trench. And I guess when I did it, I was kind of in my 20s and a bit cheeky. I asked them anything, really. And I thought the worst they can do is slap me around the chops and throw me out. But most of them were only too pleased to kind of talk about this stuff. And they love talking about the minutiae of food and drink and mademoiselles and, all this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about Egypt beforehand in the bordellos. I think one of the second biggest casualty count was venereal disease from the early days of training in Egypt. But that is something else that really came across from these, and I was fascinated by, was the food and the flies and the smells, those things that these fellows would... I'm just going to see if I can pull up a little bit about the food, but this was the kind of color that's made it for me. But Our food was mostly bully beef and biscuits. The biscuits were so hard you could hardly bite them. After 3 months, we got mouldy bread from Egypt, 1 loaf to 2 men. We could just eat the crusts. They were talking all the time about these extraordinary battles they were involved with. And in the background was like they were really hungry. It was really hard to get food. They'd open a can and like if it was jam, or like flies would just swarm on it. That for me was the unimaginable stuff that I'd just never encountered before.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly with Gallipoli, the extraordinary conditions there compared to the Western Front, particularly with the heat and the problem with flies and unburied dead in no man's land, making that kind of even worse. But I interviewed a British veteran of Gallipoli who said they were given a batch of bully beef tins, and they'd not had any bully for a while, and they opened them up, and he said literally you poured it out of the tin. It was liquid bully. He said it was just disgusting. He said, but we were so hungry, we just ate it. We ate anything that was put in front of us. He said, because if we didn't, like you've said, the flies would be on it in 5 seconds flat.
Mm. Do you feel that the exposure that we as audiences have had to like war films and even these veterans' accounts has made us like more able to hear what these folks were talking about?
I think so in some respects, but also I think it's kind of also made it worse in that people want their action movies, and there's a lot of fighting and it's bloody and it's gory and people are dropping left, right and centre. And of course that's exactly what happens in any conflict, in any war. But there is this other side to the experience of a soldier, part of a soldier's culture, which is eating food, talking with your mates, gambling, going to an estaminet behind the lines, and at Gallipoli, because they couldn't do any of that, making entertainment for themselves on those beachheads where at least there was a bit of respite before you went back up the line.
Yeah. How did you deal with, did you ever find times when they would say things that could not possibly have happened?
Yeah, I mean, I used to ask them about military discipline was another element of it. And one guy, in fact, several of them come up with these stories about executions that they'd seen, or one guy was going to be part of it. But I describe them now as estaminet stories, and estaminets were these cafes that behind the lines where soldiers sat and drank and nattered during the war, chatted, as they would say then. And I think these stories kind of spread really as the war went on. It's kind of social media, fake news on social media post today. It's like kind of World War One equivalent of that, where one of them say, "Cry, did you hear about that? That bloke down the road who popped his head up above a trench and the Germans shot him straight between the eyes? Or did you hear about that officer who refused to fight? They put him against the wall and shot him, and all that kind of stuff." And I think that in itself, it's not false testimony. It's actually what they were hearing, and it's just as important and valuable as them telling you, the kind of true story of a battle, really.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had 2 instances where they were kind of different about stuff that might have been wrong, and I made 2 different decisions. One was one of the veterans was talking about being at the top of Chunuk Bair and realising the British weren't going to come to support them, that they were absolutely stuffed. And he described seeing like bayonets glinting in Suvla Bay or something. It's quite a poetic thing, maybe like smoke from billy cans or something. And this was initially like, basically that's impossible from what I understand, or from what another historian said, they could not have seen that. It just couldn't have been seen. I felt it was important to leave that in because I don't know what that person was expressing, but it felt very vivid and very heartfelt. And maybe it was just like, I felt completely abandoned, which would be, totally accurate to them. And then actually when I said I left something out, it wasn't me, it was Shadbolt and Pugsley in Voices of Gallipoli made an interesting decision. I think there's almost no hearsay in it. And I'm sure there was hearsay in the interviews. And in fact, when I've seen some criticism, it was like, oh, they didn't put this bit in about this incredible thing of this person disappearing behind enemy lines for 2 weeks kind of thing, right? And I think that was it was a good decision from Shadbolt to leave out the hearsay and focus on the stuff that the person could go, I was there, I did this, I saw this, but totally debatable. And I think both are really interesting. So I'm sure that Christopher Pugsley, and he also used the same material for his Gallipoli, the New Zealand storybook that you read, and he added context and stuff as well. But I'm sure he would have kept in a bit of the stuff that Shadbolt decided hearsay not right for this particular project.
I mean, at Gallipoli, they were kind of obsessed with the idea of female Turkish snipers, for example. And you read, the memoirs of guys and letters, and they're talking about this. And I think it became one of these kind of stories that develop. If you think about it, like a unit like the Otago Infantry Battalion, it's been up the line, it's held the positions at Chinook Bay, comes back from that, and they've got a few days, maybe a week off from it if they're lucky. There's nowhere to go. They're all sitting there. And, within an infantry unit, one of the kind of conveyors of news is the post-corporal who delivers the letters. And I think that's kind of how a lot of these stories, the genesis of them came about, is that he'd say, I was talking to a bloke, in the Canterbury Regiment, and he told me ... And then by the time it gets to the 100th bloke in the battalion, that story is like, Hitler's on the moon or something like that, the World War I equivalent of that kind of thing. So, but I think, they are still part of what these guys saw and thought and felt. And the guy who, up there on that incredible position at Chinook Bay, looking down and feeling isolated and thinking that he saw the smoke from billy cans or the glinting bayonets of British soldiers who hadn't come up to assist them, is part of his story.
Yep. I think it is part of, that means it's part of the history. Like, if that was something that 100 people were very aware of, then I think we need to trust the audience. That's why I love just putting it out there. And, experts like you can provide guidance on that stuff, but just, trusting the audience with things. I'll tell you the other potential, slightly controversial thing. And one of the reasons that several of the voices were left out of the documentary was they were a little critical of high command at times. And I'm going to speak aloud a brief passage by John Skinner. He says, I was in charge of a sector at Corney's Post when General Godley, the New Zealand commander, arrived for a visit. It was the only frontline inspection I saw him make. He had 3 or 4 high-ranking staff officers with him, but there was no mistaking General Godley. He wore his red tabs and stood 6 foot and 3 inches. He wasted no time passing through. He seemed to be in a hurry to get back to the beach. It was a pretty poor performance, a lesson in how not to make such a visit to the front line. He never said, good day, boys, or you're doing a good job here, or anything of the kind. He didn't even ask us a question or look through a periscope at the Turk positions. He just went for his life through the trenches. I'm satisfied that he returned to headquarters after visiting Courtney's Post without having a clue as to what the ground between Courtney's and the Turks was like. I've often thought about it. Now, that's very vivid, and I would say it's probably true to his experience. Where Leonard Thornton, the presenter of the thing, got a bit upset was that Godley was, he was there doing a visit. He was actually known for going along and visiting the front lines and doing it. So potentially my friend John caught him on a bad day, but I believe John saw that. And I don't think that one statement should tell you everything about the character of General Godley. But I think it's important that it makes the history records.
No, definitely. And I think it tells us a lot, perhaps, about the mindset of New Zealand soldiers, that they are men, as you said, who often had emigrated to New Zealand before the war. They might be second generation New Zealand, English, Irish, Scottish families that have kind of gone there to settle in New Zealand. But it's a new world to them. And I think that with it, they bring a new world mentality and outlook that is different, perhaps, to the class-ridden society of Great Britain, where I'm not saying that they didn't challenge the kind of narrative of things. There was a lot of Manchester Regiment guys at Gallipoli, for example, who come from quite middle-class families and all were working-class lads from Manchester. And the stuff that I've read on them, I think that they were quite critical of some senior officers as well. But I think that what it tells us, I guess, is how that they saw fairness or unfairness within a hierarchy and what they felt and expected from a senior commander, not just to rush through the trenches and go home for his tiffin, but to stop and talk to the blokes.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised by how little of the high the commanders and all that gets mentioned in Voices of Gallipoli. They get their orders and they do their stuff. I think there's one mention of Winston Churchill, and that's almost more of a hearsay thing about, being a bit grumpy at his planning. General Godley comes in for a little bit of criticism, that's for sure. But other than that, they kind of just do their job, and they're relatively well trained. They'd all been territorials beforehand and so on. So I guess these are also the ones that survived. Like, they tended to advance and move forward and do it first. And that helped them kind of make it.
And in this work that you did, you've focused on 3 individuals from this Bad Luck Battalion, the Otago Infantry Battalion: John Skinner, Henry Lewis, and George Sonny Skerritt. I mean, I don't know if you want to tell us a bit more about them.
Yeah, it's so these are 3 fellas from Otago, the region of New Zealand, right down the south, next stop, kind of Antarctica. So John Skinner, he would say, in August 1914, I was working on a farm in central Otago, isolated place a long way from a post office, with newspapers only once or twice a week, so I was a little late in learning that New Zealand was at war. He joined up immediately. As he says, it was the correct and proper thing to do. He wasn't looking for adventure, or especially to defend the British Empire. Either joining up was the correct and proper thing to do, or it wasn't. I had no doubts whatsoever about the correct and proper course. And that correct and proper attitude takes him all the way through. That's whether you're advancing under fire, having just climbed up a ridge on a rope with your rifle slung round with orders that are just completely bamboozling to you. George Sonny Skerritt, Māori, a very interesting voice, though not in the Māori battalion, from the South Island. He was working on the wharves at Bluff. He went along with his mates. I don't know why I joined up, he says. I knew all my mates were going, so I did too. Loyalty to the British Empire never had much to do with it. He said, the last thing he thought about was king and country. He was a medical orderly, so he was supporting the doctors. So his account is often from the dressing stations. He was pushing a lot of morphia pills into people's mouths and just dealing with stretcher bearers. What did he say? Ashore, it was frightful, terrible. I'd never seen anything like that before. We dealt with everyone at our dressing station, not just Otago boys. Australians and New Zealanders were all mixed up at that stage, but it was a big shock seeing Otago boys. One's from home, ones you knew. I was very disturbed. The advanced dressing station had a doctor, 5 of us orderlies. All we could do was temporary things, nothing very big or serious. Stomach wounds were the worst, though they turned out to be better than head wounds, of course. We were fairly close to the firing. I don't mind saying I was afraid. Yeah, I was afraid. It felt pretty awful. Turks up there above and liable to be down on top of us at any time. Now, that fear comes through. He admits later on, he says, I considered suicide. And that was a theme. People pointed it out. Like, a lot of people would basically walk standing upright back from the dunnies to get picked off by a sniper. That was happening. And these were people who had survived 4 months of just hell. And they did that. And it was, it's incredible. Very sensitive fellow, George Skerritt. And then you see Henry Lewis. Henry was described by Morris and Christopher as the most bitter of the veterans. I don't feel that we certainly don't play that up. I feel that he called it how it was. But what you hear from him, he's the voice that I told you about, coming back and not being able to get work. I think that really hurt his feelings there. But another thing he says, this is during the action at the Battle for Baby 700, so May 2nd, 3rd, about a week after they'd been, decimated isn't the right word, is it, Paul? Because is decimation like 10% of people gone?
Yeah, these battalions just torn apart at Gallipoli, really.
Yeah. By the end of this day, the end of the second week, they would be down to 80 walking men that that could do this at all. But he said, Henry, I was way up on the left. I saw this little sergeant major, a pommy I didn't like much, hiding behind me. He planned to keep me in front of him. I thought, bugger you. Left him to it and climbed onto higher ground. From there I could see the Turks moving. The moon hadn't come up. The top of the ridge was all scrubbed, but I could just see the Turks crouched down, coming down, creeping towards us. To me it looked like some ruse. I sung out to the blokes below. I said, keep down, don't get up here. But of course some of them didn't hear. And the moment they got up, that whole ridge where the Turks were became a row of fire. Every Turk opened fire on the Otago blokes who got up. They threw hand grenades too. It was our introduction to hand grenades that night. We never knew the things existed. While all of this was going on, it was deadly. Most of the Otagos died straight away. Some of them just caught alight. So that's a hell of an experience to have. And you'll see like the way that we perform. I don't think bitterness needs to be a part of how it comes across, but Henry was described as bitter. And then you get this audio that I've created. It's the first of these interweaves. I'm going to do ones with the different battalions as well, but this is called the Bad Luck Battalion, and it is because of the reputation that the Otagos suffered such bad losses. And this is George again, the very sensitive one, saying after the battle for Baby 700, so about the 3rd of May, when the survivors of the attack got back to the beach, they felt pretty awful about things, of course. There weren't many Otago boys left. It was a bad night for the Otago battalion. We got a bad spin. Some people said we were the Bad Luck Battalion. We really were. We felt betrayed. There's a lot of disillusion. Nobody expected it to be as bad as it was. General Godley wasn't very popular. After that day in May, that disillusion really started. So that having that hanging over you, that amidst all this death and carnage, that your lot is known as unlucky as well. I mean, what a hit. And I've got Henry and John, and this is where I've juxtaposed two people. Now, you'll be able to tell me whether they're saying different things here or actually not, but Henry, we took a tally next morning. After that attack, we only had 80 fit men left in our regiment, 80 out of maybe 1,200. And then John says, it was perhaps 2 days before we could be assembled, and it was seen at last how few we were. As few as 200 of the 1,000 landed on Gallipoli a week earlier.
Yeah, I mean, those kind of losses weren't unusual at Gallipoli because of the ferocity of the fight and how one of the things that I think surprises people when they go there today is how close the combatants were, and the actual battlefields where they fought are kind of really small. They're tiny, and you have all these men in it, and grenades and machine gun fire and Turkish rifle fire, and then artillery and kind of everything else. And it's not surprising that these units melt away. And the first these guys would have the sense of it, they'd see blokes falling around them, but then they'd come out the line and go down one of the gullies to the beach and have a bit of R&R on the reserve positions there. And then they'd have roll calls. Each platoon, each company would have roll calls, and that's when you'd see the stark reality of the casualties around you, because the blokes that you will have remembered parading with in Egypt, before you got on the boats to come, they've all faded away.
It must have been so demoralising, right? Those roll calls. Henry says it wasn't even safe to swim in Anzac Cove at midnight. The big gun was always shelling from Anafata, farting Annie, we called it. These are the stories that these guys, you'd after everything that they've been through, you'd lose a man like going for a swim at night, like picking lice out of his thing, sitting. It was just so random. And I have been to Gallipoli as well. I really want to go back again now that I've done this. But yeah, I, like you, was shocked at this idea. Half a tennis court would separate these trenches, and allegedly 3,000 dead in an acre, I believe, was. Yeah, there were bodies lying out in the hot sun, 3,000 Turks in one particular acre. They swelled up to a tremendous size and turned black. If you tried to advance, sometimes you'd find yourself having to shelter behind the bodies, and bullets would hit into them. The pong would be asphyxiating.
Yeah, I mean, it's that scale of the losses, and for every attack that New Zealand soldiers, Australians, British soldiers that were there, and the French as well, or every attack they made, the Turks threw counterattacks back at them to try and push them back and overrun their positions. And then, of course, they'd get caught in no man's land, and the no man's land would be full of their dead. And it leads to this point, by the summer, where it's so hot, and it gets incredibly hot at Gallipoli in July through to August. Then this awful smell across the battlefield, and the sanitary conditions in the front line, with rotting corpses and the flies and everything else, leads to, which I think you mentioned in this, the armistice to bury the dead.
That's right. George has a very poetic way of putting it. He says it was like living in a big graveyard with bodies above the ground instead of under. And then they describe the armistice. So the smell, that smell was with you all the time in Gallipoli. It was a smell you could never lose. And as well as the food, they're also all dealing with dysentery by that stage. And then the armistice, there was this armistice to clear the dead. Many of the bodies, you couldn't manhandle them. You couldn't move the bodies. After 3 or more weeks in the heat and sun, they were so rotten, they were falling to pieces. So my job, says George, was to look out for the Otago bodies. Actually, I only found one. The rest were either buried before I got there on the Turk or on the Turk side of the line. They put a line of pegs halfway between the lines, each peg with a little strip of white calico. We buried all the men on our side of the armistice line, and they buried all of the men on their side. But that wasn't the first idea. The first idea was that we'd pick up the Turks on our side of the line and carry them over the centre line. The Turks would do the same with our fellows on their side. This turned out to be impossible.
Yeah. I mean, look at what J.R.R. Tolkien made of the Western Front and how that influenced his writing. What if he'd have been at somewhere like Gallipoli? I mean, who knows what he would have gone on to write. And it's kind of, I mean, these men came from, ordinary lives. They lived in the countryside very often, or they worked as a clerk in the city, or, whatever it was. And they're in an alien landscape here, an alien world, really, where everything is turned upside down.
In terms of the comparison between the Western Front and somewhere like Gallipoli, several of these fellows from Voices of Gallipoli ended up over there. But what would the differences have been? They both seem awful, but were they awful in their own ways?
I think Gallipoli, it's the scale of it, the small scale of it, is that they were confined into these relatively small areas with nowhere to get away. I mean, on the Western Front, you could go into a battle like the Somme or Passchendaele, and your battalion could get chewed up there, and you'd come out and you could be away from the trenches for weeks, rebuilding that battalion, rest, just hearing the rumble of gunfire in the distance, but you're away from it. Whereas at Gallipoli, you were never away from it. I mean, you mentioned about going to the Dunny, going to the loo. Guys were killed on the toilet at Gallipoli with shrapnel exploding in the air above those kind of positions. And no one was safe. Nowhere was safe. Nothing was safe. And you knew, I think that added to the stress of it. You knew there was no way to get away, really.
Yeah, so there was just no relief. There were no that you might have had experience of if you were fighting in other theatres.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting talking about, I think I mentioned before that Henry said, he hadn't seen hand grenades before. And the experience of ordnance was quite interesting to me. John says, oddly, the thing that gave me greatest fear was not bullet or bomb, but Turkish planes flying over and dropping metal darts down on us. They're about 6 inches long, very sharply pointed and spun as they descended. I hated the thought of a dart dropping on my head. They seemed worse than bullets. You can't see bullets. They're past you even before you know they're coming. You could see shells arriving. You could see a 4-inch shell coming over like a black cricket ball. And you never knew exactly where it was going to land. You just hoped it was going to land somewhere you weren't. Big shells were the best in that respect. What they called whiz-bang shrapnel was more treacherous. You couldn't see it coming. It either burst and it either got you or it missed you. Like this, just 24... The only reward for surviving is to be in this scenario for another 7 months, I think. Yeah. January was the evacuation, right? So April to January.
Yeah. I mean,
summer, winter.
And you've got that threat. I mean, the flechettes that you mentioned there, these aerial darts that they dropped out of the aircraft.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no good way to die. But those kind of things, they once people realised they existed, it kind of scared the living daylights out of people. And they appear in contemporary newspapers at the time, almost cited as if it's some kind of war crime that the other side is doing. Well, we know that every side had flechettes by 1915, so it was something that existed. It was a way of turning an aircraft into a weapon, which it had never really been designed for. It was an observation platform, but suddenly in a war, it took on a greater kind of significance, and you could put weapons on it, or you could chuck things out of it that exploded or killed people, or both in some cases.
And were these planes flying higher than rifle range? Was there any response to them?
They could fire at them with heavy machine guns. I mean, an infantry battalion had Maxim or Vickers machine guns, but they not really, I don't think, ever trained in anti-aircraft fire. So you kind of blindly firing away. I mean, it's a particular skill with an automatic weapon to successfully engage a target in the sky, and probably in Egypt it's something they never trained for, because
Absolutely.
it was never thought that it would ever be a situation that would arise. I mean, they're going to land on that beach. Next day they're going to be in Constantinople, on thereabouts.
I'm quite interested in the counterfactual, and I think this is the playwright in me, but I've become very interested in what would have happened if Chunuk Bair had worked, if they had managed to secure that push into Constantinople, like whether the Russian Revolution might have been averted, or, I mean, if it had worked, it could have potentially had a massive effect on the war at a very important time, right?
I think you can say that about so many battles, but I think the thing about Gallipoli is that when the first time I went there, when I travelled from Istanbul, as it is today, no longer Constantinople, to Gallipoli, I was surprised at the nature of the terrain between those two places. It's kind of rolling, in the UK we call it downland, this kind of chalk downland with rolling hills. So even if Gallipoli, they'd broken out of Gallipoli and got on the road to Constantinople, there's ridge after ridge after ridge for the Turks to defend, and they've got the whole of their kind of country behind them to pull in hundreds of thousands of reinforcements to defend home soil. I don't think we'd ever have got there. It's kind of vainglory to think that something like Gallipoli could have succeeded. What the lesson, I guess, from a military point of view, is you don't land your men that far from an objective. Did they learn from it? Well, you've only got to look into any conflict to see that no one learns half the time from some of this stuff. But that's perhaps a story for another day. But I think in terms of the experience of these guys, I guess you had to have hope, didn't you, that there would be some successful outcome to this, particularly when you'd seen all your mates get mown down in these battles.
Yeah, well, you'd think so, but it never seems to come up in this. It's as if these folks just experience and endure. So, John will say misery was one of the disadvantages of Gallipoli, in his way of saying the smell of the dead, the flies, dysentery, and the food. I took my feeling out on the vultures I saw flying over the battlefield. Not that I saw them feeding on dead bodies, but almost every morning 12 or 15 of them would fly over the ANZAC position towards the Turk lines. I had a shot at them every time they flew over. I never hit one, but I frightened them enough to make them fly off at a tangent. Otherwise, I was quite fond of birds. I've always been a keen bird watcher, but there were very few others to observe at Gallipoli. But that philosophical, it surprised me, the absence of, why are we here? What are we doing? What's this all about? It's just, we went across to Cape Helles to support the Brits. They were just told, they did. And yeah, I read their stuff about General Godley, a little bit of but it's not a bitterness. And it's very surprising to me, because I think we can look back now and say, why did they get put in this situation? How could that happen? But whether it was a sense of duty or just fate or philosophy, I don't know, but I would be grumbling.
I think a commonality of kind of soldiers' experience is that once they've been into battle and they survive these things, but they've seen comrades fall, they look for meaning in that comrade sacrifice. And even if they can't see a bigger picture meaning to where they are, that this will change the war, win the war, whatever, they like to see value in the sacrifice of those that they've stood alongside. And perhaps no one else but them will understand that. And I think that is a kind of common theme in the accounts of men, not just in the First World War, but in kind of any conflict, but particularly in the First World War, when the scale of losses were often so high.
Yeah, that they were palpably aware of the people that they missed. I'm just drawn to George saying 5 bluff boys and new friends were killed in our first half hour ashore. I remember one I used to play cricket with, a cousin I used to row with, a chap I used to work with on the Bluff waterfront, another I boxed with. It was a great blow when you saw them dying. It was a terrible shock when you knew they couldn't survive, couldn't live. I watched friends dying, but I couldn't imagine myself dying. That was just the first day. That was just April 25th.
Yeah, and they're having to process all that on a day that should have been a day of victory for them.
Did they think that they might get ashore that day, seize the heights, and then was that the plan? That it would be like a
Yeah.
securing things after a day.
Land on a beach, get up those heights, get over that high ground, start pushing inland. The British doing the same at Cape Helles, the French alongside them, the Navy ready to exploit any kind of push up the narrows, the waterway between the Dardanelles and Asia. But of course, it was. I mean, it's vainglory. There's no way any of this stuff was ever going to happen. We can look at it now. They didn't have the ability to land a force of that size and sustain it. They didn't have the communications to control a force of that size pushing over that kind of ground. And they totally underestimated the Turks in terms of their ability to fight well and defend their homeland. I mean, that is one of the things that they learn, is that when you're fighting an army that's defending its own soil, it looks upon things differently and it fights a lot harder.
Yeah, it's interesting you saying how close they were to each other, that they would be very aware of each other all the time. What was very interesting, given how close they were, there was certainly not a lot of interaction between the two talked about by these blokes. And I'll just read you what Henry says. When the Turks made their big attack later in May, you didn't have time to think about dead mates. You just had to hope you had enough ammunition to keep popping it into the Turks. I never thought nothing about killing Turks. Some say they were fine fellows, but I just thought they were a pack of bastards. They weren't the clean fighters they got cracked up to be. We knew they killed prisoners. That is a common thread across all the voices. People had a job to do, especially describing the bayonet attacks. One of them says, everybody hated bayonet attacks. The Turks hated it worse than us, but they just frickin' did it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things about, again, this gulf between soldier and civilian. When you come back from a conflict and you've been in some of these battles, like in Baby 700, the fighting in Krithia and Chunuk, particularly Chunuk Bair, which was absolutely brutal, particularly with the Turkish counterattack that Mustafa Kemal led down those slopes. I mean, all of that, I mean, you can't convey to people what it's like, really, to have to kill or be killed and how tough the enemy is. And people today like to think, oh, well, our guys are no different than theirs, and really they were all friends. And possibly in years that followed, they kind of thought that way to an extent, but I think at the time their job was to engage, and it was to kill the enemy. It wasn't to make friends with the enemy. And that if your mate's sacrifice meant something, that was a kind of part of the culture that you then had to continue with, And I think that whole idea of what motivates people to kill in a war is a really important aspect of this that you can only get through the kind of testimonies that you're putting out here.
Yeah, it's do you think people, I mean, were they trained to do that? Do you have to be trained to suspend your whatever sense it is that resists at that moment?
I don't think they were. I mean, they were given rifle training, bayonet training, some sergeant major shouting at them, stick it in, sonny, don't tickle him, and all this kind of stuff. But they're not prepared for combat. No soldier, I think, really, apart from perhaps those who fought in the very earliest battles of the war, who perhaps had seen combat before. I mean, some of the men in the New Zealand forces had fought in the Boer War, for example. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, let's be honest, that was a kind of a sideshow compared to even what they were doing at just Gallipoli. So I don't think very many of these people were truly prepared for what this would become, because this was a whole turning, the page was turning in warfare from the old world to the new world of industrialised warfare, which Gallipoli is very much a part of.
There's the industrialised aspect, and then there's the personal. It was just this conflagration of the two, right? Like, yeah, one person with a machine gun and 1,000 people running at them. It's...
And a machine gun is the ultimate piece of technology. It's a machine. It's a man-made machine that requires a human being to operate it in the same way that you would with a spinning machine or a lathe or something like that. But this thing is not designed to make something good. It's designed to kill people on a battlefield, and that is the reality of combat, sadly.
Yeah. I want to find, it's not in the Bad Luck Battalion, but Vic Nicholson, who's the next one I'm going to do is going to be about the Wellington Battalion, who were most involved in Chunuk Bair. I'll read you a little bit of Vic's experience of that. Chunuk Bair was only a ridge, and it was well covered by the Turks on Hill Q and by others on high ground. The first we knew was rifle fire and a bayonet attack. When we got to the top, we didn't have time to look at the view. I never saw the narrows. There were just hills and more hills, and we asked ourselves, where do we go from here? Because there didn't seem to be anywhere to go. At that stage, we didn't know where we were. We were told later that Hill 971 was our objective, some 1,400 yards on. Who knows? Nobody thought to mention it. Then we were on Chinook Bear. We were soon getting even less of a view. The rifle fire became more and more intense until it was just a sheet of bullets almost at ground level. Our field of fire was between us and the Turk heads coming up over the hill. The first thing we saw them was heads. Heads were our targets. There soon seemed to be thousands of them. The heads, our targets, got bigger as they came closer. By the time the Turks were fully in view, they were within 20 feet in bayonet range. It was time to start with the bayonet. Then you discovered that your rifle was too hot to hold. I mean, red hot, practically on fire. You had to grab for a cold one, perhaps a Turkish rifle, as long as it was cold. As the attacks became more intense, Wellington infantrymen had 2 or 3 rifles, one to shoot from and the others to use for bayoneting. Short rifles and short bayonets were best. The bayonet fighting seemed to last weeks. I suppose it was only minutes. No one likes bayonets, and the Turks seemed to like them even less than us. I don't remember any charges. It was all stand and defend with the bayonet, just a mad whirl. In the back of my head, I could hear the words, "Get the bastard before he gets you. Get him or he'll get you." That was the fact of the matter. I don't remember bayonets going in. Perhaps I shut my eyes. I don't know who I killed and who I didn't. There's always a chance that people with very bad wounds will recover, so you don't know. I wasn't conscious of all the fighting around on Chinook Bear, only that in my little area. At one point, 8 or 9 of us were cut off and surrounded by Turks. They motioned for us to put our rifles down and hands up, but we got stuck in and got out. It was they who finally had their hands in the air. That episode seemed to last hours, but it must have been a fraction of a minute. The Turks were heaving bombs at us too. We had no bombs and we couldn't shoot back at bombs. And darts. No one had hats or badges or identification. The Turks were the same. Soon it was you could only identify a Turk by his hat, his whiskers and his swarthy complexion. I lost my dearest friend Teddy Charles that day. We joined up together, saw the campaign through until Chinook Bear. There were no officers left, no NCOs, just soldiers. Teddy led 30 men forward, try and hold the ridge. He called, "Come on, Vic," but I was impeded by Turkish fire. We never saw those 30 men again. Later in the dark, I thought I heard Teddy's voice calling for his mother, then for me. By then the place was crawling with Turks and I couldn't get to him. He's still on Chinook Bear, a pile of bones. We were terribly aware of our wounded as the day went on. They filled our little forward trench. It was only 3 feet deep in the first place. It wasn't long before the dead and wounded were so piled in that trench that we were trampling on them, standing on them with cover only up to our knees, and all the time you're thinking, what can we do for them? But there wasn't anything. There wasn't anything you could do for them. They might have been friends, but there was nothing to be done. It would have been suicide for a stretcher bearer to come forward to us. There was just this curtain of fire across the crest of Chinook Bear, a foot to 18 inches above the earth. I know stories that we shot some of our own wounded up there on Chinook Bear. Personally, I never had to face up to that one, and yet no doubt it would have been a mercy, a blessing for wounded to have been shot by their own men. The bombs that went into the trench made even more carnage among the wounded and the dying underfoot. There were more and more dead. If I was asked to give a description of the colour of the earth on Chinook Bear on the 8th or 9th of August, I'd say it was a dull or browny red. And that was blood, just blood. It seems Otago blokes decided that Wellingtons up the front were getting it pretty hot. They fixed their bayonets and came up and mingled with the Wellingtons in our sector and gave us a hand. At least I have that impression. It might have been another angel of Mons and an illusion of vision. That's what things were like.
I mean, that's just incredible. What an account.
How could you not let that account just speak for itself, right? Like, screw the documentary, just let Vic tell that story. And there's more to it, of course, and I'd be delighted to share all this stuff with your listeners, because I think it is so valuable and so different. But it's pretty intense too, isn't it? It's like...
It is, yeah. And I think one of the things that... I mean, you've produced the kind of audio of this, and there's also the e-book, and I was reading the accounts of the guys in there, and, you know, all these men survived Gallipoli. Some went on to fight other battles, but they had to live with the memory of all of it for the rest of their lives. And Henry Lewis says, "I don't like to think about Gallipoli now, not any more than I have to, but most of it I can never forget." And I kind of think, again, this is the value of these kind of testimonies, understanding how these guys coped with the experience of this for the remainder of their lives.
Yeah, and in some way, I think we're doing Henry a favour. We're taking a bit of a load off by periodically just letting him speak and hearing those words. Because, yeah, he had the weight of that his whole life. And I like the idea that, at a certain time of year, we just give those guys the time of day for a little bit. I think it helps them out, and I think it helps us as well.
And today on ANZAC Day, many people will be having those thoughts about their family members, remembered conversations, letters they've read, or just a faded photograph in a frame on the wall.
Absolutely. And many, many will have relatives who were not able to express what happened to them. And in between all of those beautiful things, I think their story is held as well. So that's another reason that I think the more that we can spend time with them in different ways, the more you can get back to your person who might not have had the words or had the audience to be able to help take the load off.
Absolutely. So Arthur, where can people find what you've done?
So the best place to go is vog.care. That is the Voices of Gallipoli project webpage. You'll see that the Bad Luck Battalion, which is our first audio from the series, is there. You'll be able to see some samples. You'll be able to hear a little bit. And if you want the full story, it's really easy to get as an audio, introduced by New Zealand broadcaster Jack Tame, which is a really nice thing to do. People have really rallied around this project. It's been really delightful. And then there's also an ebook version if you want to be able to read the things. And I've got a bit of an introduction about the story, a lot of what you've heard today about how these voices, came down to us, and why it's just really awesome to spend a little bit of time with them on a day like this.
And we'll put links to that on the show notes for this, and also on the podcast website.
And in fact, I can tell you, Paul, that for the first 50 listeners of the Old Frontline podcast, it's a 50% discount with a coupon code that you'll find in the description. So there you go. Thank you for having me on this.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Arthur. I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation with you about something that cuts to the very heart of my own personal interest and connection to the Great War, which is the memories of these men who I was so privileged to meet all those years ago. And the podcast has given me a platform to tell some of their stories, just like what you've been doing has given you the same opportunity to tell these guys' stories. And it's so important.
Yeah, and I hope we can talk more, because I'm fascinated. I want to do this more and work with oral histories, and the idea that you have been taking them for so long, and I would love to talk to you more about that, and maybe bringing some of those voices into the verbatim mode.
Yeah, no, it would be a pleasure. I mean, I watched, and I'm going to put a link to this on the podcast website as well, the presentation you did for the Gallipoli Association, where you kind of did it live as I think about a 12-minute video of it. And I think it's really important for people to kind of see that as well, but to see, and that's the thing that comes across really strongly to me, is how passionate you are about this.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, it's so wonderful to be on this podcast and talking to your listeners who care about this stuff, and I just want to share it with them. So yeah, come see me. I will give you everything that I've got and make it available to you.
Great. Thanks, Arthur. It's been a fantastic chat. Wish you well with this, and I look forward to see how it develops.
Lovely to hang out, Paul. See you later.
Cheers, mate. Take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.